In 1945, the British Empire was the largest territorial empire in human history, a quarter of the world's landmass, a fifth of its population. It was also the most financially insolvent state on earth. Britain had won the war, but it had already lost the peace. The empire that ruled from Cairo to Singapore, from Delhi to Nairobi, couldn't pay its bills. Its total war debt exceeded 240% of GDP, a burden that would take decades to service. And its creditors weren't in New York or Moscow. They were in the colonies themselves: India, Egypt, Nigeria, the very territories Britain claimed to govern. When an empire's subjects become its bankers, the power dynamic inverts. And when those bankers demand repayment, empires don't fall to armies. They fall to accounting. Here's the question your textbooks never asked: when does an empire become too expensive to maintain? And what happens when the answer is now? Every schoolchild learns the standard account. The colonies, inspired by the universal call for freedom and self-determination, rose up against their imperial masters: Gandhi in India, and Nkrumah in Ghana, Kenyatta in Kenya. The British, exhausted by 2 world wars and chastened by the humiliating Suez Crisis of 1956, finally withdrew. The empire fell to the irresistible forces of history, to nationalism, to the American demand for a post-colonial order, to the winds of change. It's a beautiful story. The empire evolved into the Commonwealth. British power was willingly relinquished, the moral arc of history bent toward justice. There's just one problem. The narrative is almost entirely wrong. It treats the British Empire as if it were primarily a political entity, a collection of territories governed by a distant crown. It ignores what the empire truly was beneath the rhetoric and the pageantry: an economic system. A financial machine designed to extract value, manage trade, and sustain the dominance of sterling. As the historian Bernard Porter has argued, many judgments of the British Empire arise from fundamental misreadings of the nature, causes, and effects of British imperialism. It was, he writes, a more complex, ambivalent, and in some ways accidental phenomenon than it is often taken to be. The empire didn't fall because it was defeated by nationalists. It fell because it was foreclosed upon by its own creditors. To understand why, you need to stop looking at the flags on the map and start looking at the balance sheets. The British Empire was not primarily a territorial entity. It was a financial one. The map may have been colored pink, but the true empire was drawn in pounds sterling. This was the sterling area, the world's largest currency bloc. It included not just British colonies, but independent states like Egypt, Iraq, and the Scandinavian countries, all of whom pegged their currencies to the pound and held their reserves in London. Here's how it worked. Member states held their foreign exchange reserves in London. They traded with each other in pounds. They settled their debts in pounds. The Bank of England acted as the system's chief accountant, the clearinghouse for a global financial web. As historian John Darwin described it, the British Empire represented a fusing together of 3 different kinds of empire: the settler empire, the commercial empire of the City of London, and Greater India. The sterling system held it all together. For Britain, the system had a massive advantage. It could run perpetual trade deficits, buying more from the world than it sold, because the colonies would absorb pounds as reserves. The empire was, in effect, financing London's consumption. The colonies were subsidizing the imperial center. But there was a fatal weakness. The whole system relied on trust. Colonial governments and commercial interests had to believe that the pound would hold its value and that London's promises were good. The moment that trust wavered, the entire financial architecture would collapse. Then came the war, and with it, a debt that would break the system forever. Between 1939 and 1945, Britain spent roughly £17 billion fighting the Second World War. That was more than twice the entire GDP of the United Kingdom in 1938. Where did the money come from? It didn't come from taxes. It came from borrowing. And the lenders weren't just the Americans. They were the colonies. The sterling balances were the war debt Britain accumulated to its own empire. By 1945, India alone was owed £1.30 billion, the largest single creditor to the British government, larger even than the United States. Egypt held another £400 million. Nigeria and the West African colonies held tens of millions. Britain paid for goods and services, food, raw materials, military supplies, from its colonies in its own currency. It was a form of money printing that would later trigger devastating inflation. But more importantly, it created a profound psychological shift. The colonies were no longer just subjects. They were now creditors. Britain was the debtor. After the war, Britain faced a problem no empire had ever faced before. Its subjects held its debt, and they were beginning to ask when they would be repaid. John Maynard Keynes was the most brilliant economist of his age, perhaps of any age. In 1945, he traveled to Washington to beg for a loan of $5 billion. Not because Britain was poor, but because it was bankrupt. The Americans agreed to lend the money, but there was a devastating catch. The Anglo-American Loan Agreement of 1946 required Britain to make sterling convertible within 1 year, meaning any holder of pounds could exchange them for dollars. The Americans were, in effect, forcing Britain to open its financial fortress. The loan killed imperial preference, the system that had kept the sterling area a closed market for British goods. Britain was being forced to dismantle its own economic fortress to pay its war debts. The Americans gave Britain a lifeline, but they also gave it a deadline. On July 15, 1947, Britain made the pound freely convertible for the first time in 8 years. It was the most dangerous day in British financial history since the gold standard collapse in 1931. Within 6 weeks, the country had lost $1 billion in gold and dollar reserves, nearly all of the American loan. The reason was simple. Sterling area members, including India and Egypt, raced to convert their massive sterling balances into dollars. They had been waiting for this moment. On August 20th, convertibility was suspended. The crisis was over. But so, effectively, was the British Empire. The convertibility crisis revealed the fatal trap. Britain could no longer afford its financial obligations to the colonies. Now Britain faced an impossible choice. It could default on its colonial debts, an act that would destroy trust in the pound and the sterling area entirely. Or it could liquidate the empire, sell off the assets, shed the liabilities. One way or another, the bill was coming due. Independence in August 1947 is universally described as a triumph of nonviolent resistance. Gandhi's Salt March, the Quit India movement, the moral power of the powerless. And yet, the British decision to withdraw was made in the Treasury, not in the Viceroy's house. India's sterling balances represented a claim on British resources worth roughly half the UK's annual GDP. Britain was paying interest to India on money it had borrowed from India. The drain of military occupation costs was unsustainable. The Labour government's financial analysis concluded that holding India was costing Britain more than it could possibly extract. Lord Mountbatten's accelerated timeline for independence was driven by fiscal pressure, not political expediency. The British left India not because they were convinced by Gandhi. They left because they couldn't afford the bill. India had become the empire's largest creditor, and creditors don't negotiate with their debtors. They call in the loans. In the decade following Indian independence, Britain granted freedom to dozens of colonies across Africa and the Caribbean. Historians describe it as the wind of change, the political awakening of colonized peoples. But the winds were blowing from the city of London, not from the local village squares. The cost of maintaining African colonies was exceeding revenue by the 1950s. Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, all net drains on the British Treasury. The French and Belgian colonial collapses in Indochina and the Congo had created geopolitical panic. If the British colonies followed suit, the financial and political chaos could be catastrophic. As Bernard Porter observed, the process was more complex, ambivalent, and in some ways accidental than the nationalist narrative suggests. But the economic reality is unambiguous. Britain couldn't afford the colonies, and so it set them free. For the best possible reason, bankruptcy. The British Empire was like a pyramid scheme. It worked beautifully, as long as everyone kept believing in the promise. The moment everyone demanded their money back, the structure collapsed. The Commonwealth was the restructuring. It was the political face of the financial reality. Britain had shed the costs of direct administration but maintained the economic architecture, or tried to. It was a refinancing. But restructurings, as any banker will tell you, always reveal the rot. The sterling area persisted as a de facto colonial network after formal independence, but former colonies could now diversify their reserves. India sold off its sterling balances and used the dollars to build its own industrial base. Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, a move that was as much about financial sovereignty as political nationalism. By the 1970s, most former colonies had abandoned the pound. Britain, for its part, turned to Europe. It entered the EEC in 1973, a move partially motivated by the dismal reality that imperial trade was no longer sustaining the economy. And here is the poetic justice. In 1976, the British pound collapsed, not because of colonial nationalism, but because of the very financial system Britain had created. Britain went hat in hand to the International Monetary Fund and received a bailout from the same institutions it once had dominated. The former colonies were gone. The former empire was the beggar. The empire wasn't wound down. It was refinanced into irrelevance. And that refinancing was, in the end, the most humiliating colonial experience of all. Now look at your own bank account. Look at the dollar in your pocket. Everything that happened to the British Empire is happening again, right now. The British Empire fell because the rest of the world realized the pound was only worth what the British Empire could back it with. When the imperial accounting came due, Britain couldn't pay. Today, the United States faces the exact same trap. Foreign governments hold over $7 trillion in U.S. treasuries. China alone holds more than $1 trillion. The U.S. runs a trade deficit of over $1 trillion annually, financed by foreigners' willingness to hold dollars. This is the Triffin dilemma, named for the economist who first identified it in 1960. To serve as the global reserve currency, the U.S. must supply dollars to the world. which means running trade deficits. But running deficits undermines confidence in the very currency you're supplying. The Ukraine war and Western sanctions have accelerated the shift toward de-dollarization. China and Russia are building alternative financial systems, digital currencies, gold-backed alternatives, bilateral swaps that bypass the dollar entirely. Are you seeing the pattern? This is not a metaphor, it is a prediction. The same debates are happening. The same assumptions are being made. The same mistakes are being prepared. The British Empire didn't collapse in a day. It collapsed over decades, one balance sheet at a time, and it always left behind a warning. The question is whether anyone is listening. Here is the lesson the history books will never teach you, because it threatens the order of the world today. The British Empire was not undone by war. It was undone by arithmetic. When the cost of holding an empire exceeds the cost of losing it, the empire is already gone. It just doesn't know it yet. The economic law of empires is simple. Debt inversion leads to dissolution. When an empire's liabilities exceed its ability to pay, the system enters a death spiral. There is no political will to address structural issues because the solutions are never popular. Cut spending, raise taxes, devalue the currency, restructure the debt. The future belongs to the creditor, not the debtor. Britain borrowed its way to global dominance and then borrowed its way to the IMF. America is following the same path. If you don't want your empire to fall, you have to be able to pay for it. And Britain couldn't. America, watch this space. Here's the hidden truth about the fall of the British Empire. It was never about the colonies. It was always about the money. And now you see the world differently, don't you? The empire isn't dead. It's just wearing a different flag. If you want to understand how money really works, if you want to see through the political fog to the economic realities beneath, subscribe to Markets of the Past. Every week, we reveal another hidden truth that changes everything you thought you knew. Drop a #DebtFall in the comments if you've ever wondered why empires truly collapse, and if you've ever wondered whether America's time is coming. Here's the dangerous question. If the dollar is the new pound, and America is the new Britain, what happens when the world stops believing in the debt? I want to hear your prediction in the comments. The empire is not dead. It's just been restructured. And that restructuring is the story of your life.